Hello everyone, today we talk about realism, whatever it means. We will try to define it in part today, as I receive every once in a while some question from you that is, essentially what is the, let's say, greatest, I wouldn't say source, but, where can I find, realistic stuff? Mostly when we talk about history, military history, the typical thing is where I can find an adequate reconstruction of a combat, of a battle specifically. What can I read, watch, look at, and say, okay, this is fundamentally, by a certain degree of approximation, something accurate, something that realistically depicts a certain, mostly military event in history. I give this cut not just because obviously we deal mostly with history of warfare, but because I presume that actually most people are genuinely interested, or at least there is a greater search, in fact, request for accuracy, specifically in matters of combat. There are many people who are interested in, I don't know, here we talk about Middle Ages, I don't know, medieval life. I even have comments mostly from RPG players that say, can you describe in detail how that peasants worked, how was everyday life, what was the specific thing like. I could answer that too. That is to say, there's nothing specifically. I mean, the Middle Ages notoriously did not exist like any other historical eras, didactically categorized as such, but also that, that there is such a huge variety, and exactly actually because there is such a huge variety of circumstances and realities that you can find in part generally also across, the ancient and modern age, but also not something very diversified in the same Middle Ages. The fact that military history attracts realism, according to me, depends mostly on the positive fruits of the same military history, meaning the research proper. That is, most military historians, as we often say, come from a mostly rationalistic and anti-dogmatic background. Military history forces you to look at what happened in campaign and battle according to logics that you can't really bypass in order to reconstruct the thing, right? If you talk about a broader political or social issue, you can allow yourself to say, okay, the thing is so complex that it's objectively very difficult to even presume to find a broader, to follow a broader track into this, so it's maybe better to focus just on one specific topic, one specific aspect. The same history of warfare actually involves that, because when we talk about war, we're actually talking about war waged, armies fighting, violence being enacted. War is violence by definition, and naturally, there, as we've seen also in the phone cricket, war has a suspension of the military action in the course of the campaign purpose. That is, we're not always on the march, we're not always fighting, but the general purpose is that. But beyond that strategical dimension, there is properly at large also the political dimension, of course, the social one, and the idea of conflict. That is, probably one of the most difficult things to narrate, historically speaking, because where do you actually begin, right? Once I met a guy who said something like, it's so easy to teach and not just even to study military history, because you can easily say that war began on that day and finished that day, and therefore it's easy. Right? That's probably completely the other way around. In order to explain a war and what is happening in that campaign, you have to explain first and foremost why and how they arrived to fight it, and that entails the idea of conflict. That is something that can date to, I don't know, there is not properly a time span, right? You can't, by approximately speaking, normally you can talk about, I don't know, the historical enmity between two countries, or general, the ascension of a leader to the throne that brought to the conflict of, it's difficult. It doesn't stop to even to the casus belli proper is narrower, and conflict is something that dates back even the political identities. It's something human, universal, and therefore it's diluted in the universe. Where, as a historian, you have always at a certain point to stop and say, okay, well, I can't tell the whole story, right? I just have to make a history of certain aspects that I presume being more effective approximately to tell this story. And this is a fundamental, crucial moment in the historical process, because all historians do that. Like there's no other. It's a human cognitive limit. You can't do otherwise, right? So this already to set you on guard relatively to what actually we make history like, right? There is not a certified, full, complete way of making history. It's always approximate. It's always inaccurate in a certain way. Realism is something different, because realism focuses more, and that's where the military historical interest in the matter of violence, that strangely enough is at that point kind of concrete, right? Most people fail to realize actually that war, is, for example, not conflict by definition. That is to say, war is just the enactment of violence within a certain conflict, and maybe up to that point non-violent, and that is that war makes a definition. But when it comes to actually ask for realism, they mostly focus on the actual ways violence was enacted, so that the moment of combat proper is, centralized, is focused on in a concrete way. So in a way, our modern mindset, of course, has tendentially become more rational, less dogmatic, right? But at the same time, as we often say, it has acquired certain other bias that mostly has to do with faith in technology, for example. That is definitely, not a wise idea in the first place. Secondly, but not because technology is bad, right? But because simply doesn't do what most people think it does. And secondly, this kind of positivistic attitude for which you can mechanically or properly, not even deterministically properly, but in the sense that, you can't track always the causes, the logical link between the causes and the consequences, and that you can be sure about that. You can arrive to a definitive point where you have a hard fact, right? Charles Dickens mocked enough this kind of mentality, in fact, and we still haven't learned about it. And it really dates back to that period, right, in history. It really does. In positivism in 19th century, in the full of the industrial era, right, towards basically second industrial revolution, this idea that everything can be fundamentally calculated and concretized, and it's something that for large part of most of the 20th century we have fundamentally believed on, and we still bring, with ourselves as an idea that before didn't exist, right? And as something that, often serves me to explain this aspect of realism is that if you read sources before, let's say, before positivism, but also before, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, Linnean categorizations, etc., you have this is a problem that sometimes triggers historians. You have a, let's say, uncategorical way of defining certain things. That is to say, banally, when you look at pike and shot warfare, for most of its, for most of the evidence, the information that we have, we cannot even distinguish things like, were these guys using arquebuses or muskets? Like, literally, there is an overlapping of the terms of the, and hybridization. Why? And people get triggered by that. Why? Because as modern minds, we mostly think that, for example, the matter there was having an arquebus instead of a musket. That in part does make an important difference, but at a certain time it's, overrated in the basically by the ignorance of the broader context that uses forces that are dramatically more important than, the ones that can differ between an arquebus and a musket, or even thousands of arquebuses and muskets, and that have to do with how we wage war properly meant, even today. And that's where a good example of the technologistic prejudice also comes from, because it basically narrows things down to a almost engineering kind of mentality. That is, war is not about moral forces. It's about, what kind of weapon you use. And this is probably one of the grossest, more widespread, and deeply rooted and hard to die prejudices and problems that we have today when we even talk about military history. Because literally, I've met certain people that cannot cope with this concept, with the fact that this is not true, right? With the fact that this is in part real. Of course, it did weight in part, but it's absolutely not even remotely close to being decisive. Unless you, in fact, basically cut out any other factor, right? Very often being tricked by the concept of symmetry, that is to say, two armies do not fight in the same way because there is all a society behind that, and not because they use the same weapons, right? And therefore, that's also the metaphor I always use. You always look at the tip of the iceberg, right? You forget that, and you narrow it down to that kind of measure, while you ignore regularly the presence of the iceberg underneath. That is something that is way more important in making the difference. And naturally, war is, as we also explained, very often about balanced odds. So that, in order to explain World War I Western Front, obviously you look at an equilibrium of forces that was supported by similar systems. Western countries with that level of industrializations, with millions of soldiers could be sent to the front, etc. But already, if you look, at Eastern Europe, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at Africa, you see weapons were the same, doctrines were the same, but things changed considerably. And also during the course of the war, things like, cavalry was somewhat, useless for most of the war, but at the beginning it was actually important. At the end it was actually important. Why? Because conditions change, and it doesn't matter whether you all go at war with machine guns or howitzers, things change in ways that basically render these individual factors virtually insignificant, or however undecisive. So therefore you have to concentrate your attention at least on something else more that is more important than them, right? So the major problem we have with questions like, what should I read, watch, do, whatever that allows me to have kind of a realistic experience, of what was historical combat fundamentally. This is also hard to explain, or better to, I don't want to convince anybody, but, to make a point that basically flips over the question, making you understand that it's not properly a concrete question, a sound one, and that there is a better way, is difficult to explain proper and to, if anything, to be accepted, right? The point goes like this. Everything fictional is virtually insignificant in this regard. You can have movies, you can have video games, you can have literal simulators used by the military, you can have reenactment, you can have all this stuff. But the problem is there that wargaming of any sort, whatever. This thing, and we have explained it in that video on the issues on wargaming especially, is by definition fictional, right? And there is no discussion on this point. You declaredly accept that you cannot simulate going at war at some moment, and therefore you try to think what it could be reality. Certain things did actually work. Certain war games, for example, helped strategy. They gave some useful information. They surely were supported with some scientific, historical evidence and so on. But the question about those is that still there is a historical work behind them, right? Here I will not digress on wargaming specifically, but here I could easily talk about reenactment as well, right? This is something that especially touches me very, very closely because I had issues with, I must say, with reenactors, but fakely. I mean, I've always admired reenactors and reenactment per se. If anything, for the way it's done. I mean, the purpose, even there, the moral forces that stand behind reenactment. The problem I've always had, though, is that the degree of accuracy that people believe that they're achieving by certain fictional reconstructions is virtually insignificant in the absence of certain factors that are prevalent in reality. Why? Because, I don't know, there are, for example, certain video games, take FPSs, that are, pretty well known in popular culture. Well, those are easy to make in the sense that artificial intelligence, the human factor there, is probably the most, something that every kid can understand. The IA is stupid, therefore I can take advantage of that and taking it out. But let's say in the broader experience of saying, being under a rain of fire, steel, of shelling, bullets flying all around, the randomization of certain factors from the narrow perspective of a soldier, let's say, can be satisfactorily simulated in the sense of broader effects, right? You can usually think about these mods in video games that add realism. Most of the times, that already tells you how biased the audience, the consumers are fundamentally about that. What is realism? Having, some texture, some, light effects and so on that render the appearance, the visual side more real in look, right? And for most of it, it's really, realism is just about that. I mean, surpassing things that are notoriously idiotic in video games, like, just the time properly recharging a weapon that in some games is skipped, or, I don't know, the fact that, if you get shot, you should, at every time, even, have some psychophysical reactions that the game cannot simulate, that it legitimately doesn't simulate, because it would make the game, which is just a game, right? It's just fiction, less fun to use, right? It is less fun to play. This is already, the general range of factors in which usually realism is, in these experiences, is usually discussed, right? That there is properly, I say this, I don't want to banalize the topic today's video, but, there is probably, I properly, and I don't see this, no middle ground in popular culture between, let's say, historical work, right, historical accuracy, and a discussion on simulation in realism that fundamentally come closer than just these aspects of video game, right? I don't see it. There are certain video games that are naturally more intelligent, that are naturally more about, in fact, coordination, teamwork, things like that are also more difficult to play, because if anything, you have to do it with friends or other people that are much into the game, to respect the rules, and that therefore try to come closer to what they think a soldier would do on the field, right? But already this aspect per se is just discussing, for example, the individual experience of a single soldier, right? That is obviously, from a sheer mathematical, physical point of view, the easiest thing to fictionalize and come closer in relative terms, right? That is not to overlap or to come even remotely actually close in absolute terms to reality. Everybody knows that. They're just games, right? Yes, but if the broader discussion revolves about realism, mostly revolves around that dimension, and this is, you wouldn't believe how much this is projected in other fields, right? You immediately start with a wrong foot. It's like with movies today. I think movies from 20 years from now, mostly about modern warfare, things like contemporary warfare, just tend to stick to a video gaming first-person shooter's perspective. Let's be honest, like, it's easy, it's cheaper. First of all, the least actors you have, the less you have, the least you have to pay, the less you have to keep them, the less you have to to simulate the broader complication that just by a mathematical obviousness renders the thing more difficult to simulate. Because, by the way, simulate, it implies literally the idea of literally fictionalizing the thing. It's by definition, and that's what we should stick in our mind, that we try not to do because we want to live in the fantasy, which is not a good idea in life in general. Is about, right? It's pretending that all the issues we could have with that reconstruction do not count, or that at least you can develop this sense of false security in believing that narrowing the calculation on a few factors is actually what makes the thing done. And it's easy. Why? Because literally most people think through small factors, right? They have difficulties to have a complex thinking. This is banal, right? But studying history is not done just for fun, right? There is a reason why we do it, and why we tend to expand our mind in the process, and why, unfortunately, for somebody that doesn't get to that point, the thing cannot be seen because your brain literally hasn't processed it, and therefore is not able to reason in a more complex way, and that therefore you can easily buy more and more people, or at least the larger amount of people through that, rather than making their brains applying to something actually intelligent, right? The individuality of the experience is in fact what mostly, for this sheer, as we've seen, material problems, right? We have difficulty to reproduce. Even reenactment, usually it's rare to find, hundreds of reenactors trying to simulate fights altogether. And people even in there say, okay, so these are hundreds, so this is more realistic, this is what it should be like in reality. Not even. Why? Because even that is not actually even remotely close to the point. Because making a spectacle in which you want to honor, the memory, the past, some aspect, the work of people that study, maybe the work through these things, their own life, and they wait for that moment to have fun, to have a broader historical. The most beautiful thing of reenactment is that brings people closer to history. The problem I have even just with historians, that I have just even with archaeologists, and I have also with reenactors in the same way, right, is that the more popular this thing gets, and I actually don't see the further step of actually teaching people to understand why that is limited rather than why that is actually something real, right? This is true even look at historical disclosure, right? I can even take Schwerpunkt itself as an example. I make here some small history at the end of the day. Only every once in a while I make kind of more, constructed points, because guess what? It takes years sometimes before having the competence to discuss even certain things. So it's obvious that I talk about so many things about which I'm not an expert of. I base myself on literature, on evidence, but I don't have the time to process all that evidence as, the expert that actually studied this stuff for 20 years, right? In that specific, that I try to discuss like in 1 hour in one of my videos. So that sometimes when I say, these videos are too long, yes, well, welcome to, just be thankful that I don't make you actually, I don't prepare videos that are supposed to explain you what the whole issue is. And believe me, from a moral point of view, ethically, if I really feel challenged every time I make these videos, because I always think, am I actually good at explaining this? Am I competent enough? Am I getting to the proper point of the story here? This is not just about my tangent, my sidebars, etc., my digressions. It's literally about, am I able to put here within the video enough information about the actual point that I'm trying to make people understand, right? Because believe me, it's incredibly difficult. There is a video I want to do tomorrow, for example, about the Battle of Rio Salado, and I'm as you know, I specialize in tactics, and I found now I don't have the time to study all the sources. I don't even know the original language and vernacular, so I'm actually reading literature on this. and more or less having an idea what may have happened on the field. And I will tell you, maybe we'll be talking for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half about that, but I'm actually not sure that, and I will tell you, of course, and that I always do that, I have an idea, or let's say a satisfactorily accurate idea of what I think happened, right? Because that's what the historian always wonders. Have I done enough? Have I explained convincingly? Have I all the evidence I need to make this point? Because that's what we do. And what we do essentially in here is that we challenge ourselves to bring on the fore not the minutiae. This is what also many people get wrong about history or archaeology or reenactment, etc. That the detail is literally, by definition, the least important thing, right? It's like saying, I don't know, people believe generally, as I told you before, having a weapon or another actually is what makes the difference in war. It's leaving aside that every HEMA practitioner would tell you that it doesn't matter what weapon you have, but how you can actually use it. But even in that, I don't know whether it's a kind of corporative attitude, but I see a lot of discussion about how, yes, of course, the fact that weapons at the time especially were used in definitely a more effective way that we often also ignore in the actual practice before France treatises. We don't have the actual proof of how certain weapons were used in combat, and it doesn't serve the purpose. I reenacted that, therefore I know, because you don't know, because you're not a person who lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. You don't have the mindset, the physicality of a person who lived at the time. And you say, no, because I've trained, I'm strong. This is the point. Not realizing that you are not born in that context, that you mostly, historically speaking, have no idea what that was, because most people may also that do this are not actual historians or archaeologists or whatever, and reading a bunch of stuff doesn't make you one, not handling a sword actually makes you one. You can have maybe some interesting, intelligent insight about, I don't know, yes, there is a certain element of physicality. There is surely a certain element of how, a technical skill, in fencing and having certain, issues with weapons, with the armor. But the bigger point there is that, first of all, you're not motivated like a person those times. And that's singularly the most important thing that you have to take into consideration. And incidentally, it's also the least historically accessible element. Therefore, literally the most important thing in relative terms that you should know, you cannot know by definition, first. Secondly, you may be approximating things such as, for example, you're fighting not to kill. And you'd say, well, yes, thanks my eye, should I kill to test what weapons were? But, if you're interested in making that because you want to have fun, because you want to have sport, you want to go out with friends, you want to think you are like those people, you want to come closer to that experience, whatever your motivation is, it's fine. But never think that combat is anything but wanting to kill people. If you take away that out of the motivation, you are fundamentally not doing a great thing. You say, well, there wasn't just about killing people. What about tournaments? Yes, it is true, but you think you're actually motivated, like, if you practice in 15th century plate armor, let's say, you have the same level of political, social motivation that a 15th century knight could have at the time, that you had the same, life experiences, the same mindset, the same physique that person could have. And remember, this is not, men at the time were not bodybuilders. They were not superheroes. They were not Übermenschen. They were something that we actually even come close to understand what it could be like, and that we lack by definition in the present world, even among athletes and practitioners that do this thing for a living, right? So I have no doubt of sort, for example, that I would have liked to be a reenactor, right? Not because, I would even have the physique for doing certain things. I've always been fascinated. Actually, the thing I would have loved the most would have been gone on horseback. But and I'm perfectly sure that a reenactor has some knowledge that, for example, I would never have until I did their own thing, right? Like everybody, like you should always start from this is very healthy mentally speaking, from the fact that doesn't matter whom, but in this world, every single person can teach you something that you will not know otherwise, and that will not also fully know as that person. Doesn't matter how much you have studied, how much you've trained, how much you've practiced. There's always something that you're skipping that you cannot understand. It's not just a something. It's not just a tiny bit. It's often, if not always, an important bit. Right, an element that you will have also trouble to process within, from certain perspectives, from certain backgrounds. So the question there is, by the way, just fighting with, I don't know, 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2, 10 versus 10, 100 versus 100. This is what usually also reenactment, that is legitimately the closest thing that can bring you to that kind of experience, brings you to. Except, perhaps we would say, actual warfare, right? And we will explain why, because you say, but they don't fight anymore, like in 15th century plate armor. Well, yes, but they do go through things that present you with, first of all, the actual reality of a war that we will see what consists in for the sake of the positive use also of the military instrument, not just staying there, being shot at, or being under a shelling. And also, you are, in fact, basically not getting the most important thing of this whole stuff. That is, basically, armies, historically speaking, were always about hundreds, thousands of people that were trying to make themselves work on a field with a certain degree of coordination, of training, of timing, etc., that were driven by motivations that were as great as, collectively that push was, right? And that you do not have. Because you can be pushed by your own personal, interest, prestige, whatever, but as a person in the 21st century, you will never know what it means to be, I don't know, the citizen of a 12th century medieval commune that has to go at war with the neighboring commune. You will never know what it means to be bred as a grown up as a feudal knight that has to literally butcher women and children on a regular basis, and they did exactly that, believe me, and to have the psychological antibodies to cope that for a lifetime. You are not. You are sensibly weaker, more stupid, less capable, and there is nothing you can do to even presume to come close to that by any stretch of the imagination, right? And that is not just individuality. Individuality in war is nothing. First of all, you have to enter this idea. That is something that properly is not understood. In war, you personally are nothing. Unless you're not in a position of command, which is something that you have to test only if you actually go in the military through the chain of command, you are no one. It's not because you have been beaten yourself with 20 other people that you have any competence of command. If you don't know how platoon tactics work and you haven't actually enacted them on the field, you may even be a Napoleon, but simply you have zero idea whether you would be capable of doing that or not. Also, it's an acquired capacity. It must kept up. It may be actually difficult to judge because there is something also as luck and unluck. And anybody who is acquainted to military history is perfectly, realizing these aspects. Also, you in the front of what the moral and material forces that were unleashed on a battlefield, you are nothing. Already at Détray alone had a physical force that is, on average, topping the greatest physical force measured in a human being with weightlifting, right? That is the strongest human being ever existed is not stronger than the average Détray, right? And the Détray is ridden by a guy who spends his literal life on horseback, maximizing his capacity to fight collectively, that is to say with other, 40, 80 people, just to smash through whatever they find in the front of them, basically loading all the sheer amount of force on the tip of their spears crashing into you. What do you think you can be when there are 30,000 quarrels falling on a battlefield on a battlefield in 1 hour, right? It's funny when you see certain guys go out there. Oh, look, I'm able to shoot, I don't know, 3 arrows in 2 seconds. This is the great mysteries and capacities that people in the Middle Ages were. If somebody in the Middle Ages could do that, and they surely did, they would just spend that in a circus. Because guess what? This is what exactly they did. Do you think that is actually useful in combat? Do you know how, I don't know, an archer is employed on a battlefield? You know what's important there, that he's synchronizing the volleys and doing it all in a certain time. The arrows have a cost. You have a cost. There is a coordination with the various arms. Missile units by themselves were not enough, were not decisive on a battlefield. What do you think that by developing these individualistic skills you actually are simulating? I mean, not even in a tribal context that is true. In a tribal context, there would be, for example, just let's leave aside the fact that they actually fought in larger, more consistent, more capable ways that you can ever simulate, even if you were in 100, 200 people, like warbands were at the time. But the mindset and the physicality of a warrior, say, I don't know, the Iron Age, of a tribal warrior, think about the Gaelic Fiannas or Germanic Comitatus, where that is to say that you basically do not belong to yourself anymore. You're just basically possessed by a divinity that makes you be willing to die at the moment if you're simply asked by your brotherhood, and that you're capable of fighting with a javelin piercing you from side to side on a battlefield, and killing people, drinking their blood, and doing other things that you wouldn't even like to imagine. Are you that? That was their natural self. Is this your natural self? No. Right? You don't come even close. So what actually, I've watched certain guys replicating, I don't know, hoplitic combat, like poking themselves with sticks and saying, look, this is how they use the lances in ancient. Do you think what could be the mindset of a 15th century Hellenic hoplite? Do you know how these people were fanatically obsessed with figures like Achilles, with the fact that, of course, we have completely surpassed Reganian's hoplitism, Hansen's thesis have been surpassed. These guys didn't fight absolutely like that, like we have pictured stereotypically. But secondly, do you have an idea of, just physically speaking, what these people did? Even if they were actual craftsmen, they were not professional soldiers, basically, except the Spartans, all Hellenic hoplites were, and also the Spartans actually for ancient war standards weren't that much. They were just, semi-professionals, we would say, of war. There's no comparison with a tribal warrior. But even in there, surprise, surprise, what is that made a difference? Collective training, right? Which you don't quite have. Because what kind of maneuvers do you do? Do you actually have some maneuvering drill? Do you actually get out of the gym? You do this stuff like, do you march for tens of days in arms, like all together, trying to maintain information, knowing what this? There is some experimental archaeology. There is something has been done. It's so rare, so exceptional, so asystematical that, of course, what you do, just by presuming that dressing up every once in a while and beating each other with weapons, each other. Is actually simulating what I don't really know. I don't really understand. You can surely improve some. You can be an expert. Let's say if you make armor on your own, you can surely know how armor was made. That is interesting. Archaeologists especially are good at that, and they're surely contributing heavily to our understanding of that thing. But how was that thing actually important? Like, do you think that in war, like I don't know, in the ancient world, I don't know, having like a curved blade or a straight blade actually made the difference in reality, right? In terms of actual factors that influence what the outcome of a battle is. And the interesting thing, you know what it is that there is such a great, and let's be honest about this, historians, archaeologists, even reenactors in their own way, and I include them among the professionals, because even though they may not be actual doctors, whatever, but I respect their experience at the point of saying, okay, let's do this together, because in theory, we should be the same people. We are often the same people. I know some of my colleagues are reenactors. I know some archaeologists were reenactors, so there is no doubt that there is a point there. But But just among historians or archaeologists, how many people actually study from sources how actually a campaign was waged? And I don't mean like reading, a study written by someone else and then believing that, giving it a read or quoting it every once in a while is a point. I mean, literally spending years of your life studying campaigns and battles and just even realizing what was, by the sources, on a regular base throughout all the history of humanity, the average factors that would bring, for example, that would decide a battle. Do you ever find actually something like, I don't know, I studied extensively at this point tens and tens of battles in the Middle Ages in the serious way, not just in reading books with someone else, literally taking all the sources and reconstructing the thing. Was there any, when have I ever found actually that, a battle was decided by, what kind of weapon we were using? Because, first of all, armies of that time were dramatically similar, dramatically homogeneous in material culture, and doctrinally and tactically, we're talking about the same thing. I studied early 14th century European warfare. I came up with the conclusion that speaking of doctrine is kind of anachronistic, but say the way they usually felt was exactly the same. The equipment was exactly the same. At that point, there is such a level of homogenization that it's almost embarrassing. What do you think that made the difference in battles, actually? Right? Command, discipline, training, the so-called virtue of the army, as von Clausewitz called it. At the end of the day, it's all moral sources. That is how much you have been disciplining yourself, also physically, because that has an impact, but still not in a way that is not functional to actually doing the thing on the field and being able to do it well and maintaining your self-control in certain situations and knowing what that is going to be about. And I'm not saying that even in there certain factors didn't matter. I'm saying that if they mattered, they were dramatically far from even coming to be close to be decisive. Right, so they're virtually ininfluent. I've never found in these battles somebody who said, that guy won because it had better armor than the other. I mean, literally nobody. And we know, archaeologically speaking, iconographically speaking, that armor was starting to make a difference. We know from the documents that it started to cost. Is there a single battle account that tells you, those guys won because they had plate armor instead of mail armor? Leaving aside the fact that even in there, they basically wore all the same thing. But even in there, in fact, what do you think would make the difference? This idea of the collective training of command, of discipline, is something antipathetic to people for one specific reason, that most people will engage in this idea of finding realism as if they had a disease for which they can't breathe otherwise, and that believe to find it by narrowing down to the limit, to the most insignificant details, in order to focus on what the reality was about that thing. They're doing exactly the contrary of what they should be doing. They're going completely in reverse to the direction from where you can get some information. Wars are won by political and social reasons. And wars are fought also in specific ways that are focused on group dynamics and moral connections from between the commander and the troops that have literally nothing to do with how these troops are individually armed, physically fit, or capable to use a weapon in a specific way. Right? I came to meet some people that believe that, being courageous and knowing how to shoot a bow is what would make a warrior in the Middle Ages. Do you know what actual warriors, so not even soldiers, so in even more primitive forms of warfare, actually were capable of accomplishing? Right? If you look at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, what do you think? That the Germans won because they knew how to, to jump on difficult terrain, or they had a skill to use a lance in a way in the forest, or not? What do you think it worked like? That was a political masterpiece, right? They they suffered enormous losses themselves, because the Romans weren't just letting themselves being killed, but what did they do? They put, first of all, the enemy in a condition of inferiority that wouldn't normally, they wouldn't normally meet with. This is also, here I cannot expand, like, if you have problems with these ideas, go look at the von Krieger playlist, because there everything is explained in detail. There are more than 200 videos, and the whole series is exactly about this, right? The idea that symmetry doesn't quite exist, right? We have seen that armies were dramatically homogeneous, but the way, in fact, they were homogeneous were in material culture, right? Technologically speaking. That is to say, that factor neutralizes itself in a sense. So what actually makes the difference is putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority that derives from other factors. How much it takes to line up, how for example, which is also not decisive, but it's still more important than whether you're armed with a thing or not, because surprise, surprise, if you don't have even the time to take weapons down from your wagons, you can't even properly fight, and that's what the enemy is gonna wait for. It's not waiting for you to, just be fully prepared. You want to kill the freaking guy, you want to annihilate the army, there's no other way to do it. Of course, politics comes to mitigate the thing, you have ritualistic combat and so on, but that is also something that strips you even further of any other technical factor. That is to say, that's once again moral. That's something that these people decide to do for reasons that have not to do with what they have in their hands, but what they have in their mind and what they have back home. And those are the most important factors in war, right? So when we look at the concept of realism, the first thing we should ask ourselves is, what have we done to actually understand the only reality that we have, that is history? People believe that, usually, that, since we don't exactly know how things were there, we can speculate, right? We can abstractly start wondering with our minds in the clouds how it could be, without having any clue about what instead we overwhelmingly know. That is not enough for knowing the truth, but definitely for having a reality that comes straight from that world. Historical evidence is based on it. What do you think we study history for? What do you think it's the value of sources of evidence? It's just something that you can, most people, also I know many historians, many archaeologists, many reenactors that point out things like, this thing is written in this book, so that's a proof. Literally. I mean, I found these people. What do you think that the historical process is actually about? What do you think we study history for? What do you think historians exist in the first place to do? We know that nobody can simulate what happened in the past. First and foremost, so any kind of simulation that doesn't even take into consideration the fact that those people are not trying to kill themselves is completely to rule out in terms of comprehensive, importance of reconstruction, right? Once again, you can learn how to build an armor. Fine, I gained some data. I can get that little piece and adding up it to the puzzle of the broader dimension. But that's pretty much it. When you're talking about a battle, can you simulate even just the collective training that, 2,000 people have? Where do you have these 2,000 people, first and foremost, brought under the actual discipline that those armies had? That is to say, if you even dare not to obey, I break your fucking teeth all at once, right? Find me a reenactment that actually forces people to obey blindly like that, and to stay in formation no matter what, unless they don't want to be crucified with their nails fixed in their wrists and their legs broken, let to be eaten by crows. Find me where do we actually can even know how, for example, a Macedonian phalanx could work, where we haven't even tried to keep at least 4,000 people with pikes and make them work in a certain way and see what's the cohesion and the formation and how it works in the long run, because we have literally no evidence of reconstruction of that type, and put them under the political and social pressure of those kingdoms that were about to be wiped out from each other and were pushed to perform, because if this is the ridiculousness of these things. These people were fighting because if they didn't fight, their women and children were raped, cut to pieces and eaten by wolves, right? And find me a person who goes into a reconstruction with that kind of idea in mind, right? That is not to say it's as if I have to imagine it. No, it means that if you screw up, I actually take your children and women, I cut them to pieces, and then I want to see what you do. Find me a person that believes such a thing, that goes out there and even starts to come close to imagine, to pretend that they can live such an experience. There's nobody who can accomplish that. So, all in all, it's a huge waste of time. Even history itself, even the best history is a huge waste of time if you pretend that you can actually come up and say, we actually know how it was, right? The best thing you can do is pick the evidence we have, which is incomplete, is biased, is it's difficult to interpret at so many levels, even just for your own personal reasons. That is to say, if you don't know even how to translate Latin text, how the fuck you can imagine to study medieval history, no, using translations will not work if you're serious historians. Secondly, having this arrogance, huge ego, whatever, to go out there and pretending to draw out of this evidence some kind of, cogent idea of reconstruction, and starting to do that for years and years and comparing what you have and doing the best service that a human being can ever make to himself, that is using his freaking synthesis capability, that is using basically the only thing that our brain is projected by from millions of years of evolution, that is to say what no calculator, no alleged positivistic reconstruction can ever come to remote, and that can work in this sense, in the historical field, in the archaeological field, in the reenactment field, to have just an hypothesis of what things could go like, right? And doing it, and archaeologists and historians and reenactors do succeed in this. I just see that the majority of them doesn't, in any field, and I tell you as a historian. So I'm not a person who says, okay, yes, probably there is a different level of competence in certain things. I'm probably biased, and I think that historians actually get it better because we actually study on the real evidence we have, right? Not on something that we can actually see, but we have a notion of background that we ignore because we're more technically oriented. I've met with a lot of archaeologists who were actually very good at their own job, but that sometimes suffered unavoidably of mechanistic kind of prejudices. The same goes for reenactors. I met many of them, but some of them didn't even know, for example, basic history. And the question I said, the one of a manualistic exam on the first year of university, and therefore I said, are these people, acquainted with properly the historical method for the one it is? I mean, what's the average going to be? Then, as I told you, I found reenactors that were great historians, were great archaeologists. I know them personally, so I don't have any, but it's like for me as a historian, like seeing that most military historians even do not actually work according to the Clausewitzian method. They just think that talking about warfare is a broader, mostly socioeconomical problem, and not even bothering themselves to even make an effort to understand how an army could be used on the field, right? And here we're talking about people that involve great part of their time and energies to, at the end of the day, an historical end, with an historical aim. You can imagine what happens in popular culture, right? If I say that any movie that has ever been done is basically irrealistic about warfare, I immediately get like, no, because there is that scene that is so well done. There's not a single scene that is, let's say, well done in the realistic sense. I can watch a scene that is a masterpiece because it's very well done. It's accurately done in the sense that people made a freaking research to make it, that performed it very well. Technically they looked at so many details, etc. But let's be honest, especially that often, not surprisingly, happens once again in the FPS style of cinema, right? When we all look at battles, actual battles, and find me a movie that actually depicts the actual movements, maneuvers of an army on a field, right? There's not even one, but not even one that comes even remotely close to that. In terms of historical research in that field, there's not even one. In movies you find, banally, if you find a movie in which there is a cavalry charge that is not lined up, that's bullshit, because that is not historical. If you find a movie where, basically there are, even cavalry units running on the field without cohesion, without lining up, you don't understand very well what, because you're not even sure. That's not a historical, it's nothing. It's nothingness by definition, right? The same goes for infantry. For anything that, let's say, doesn't simulate something that is obviously impossible to simulate, at least enough with a gigantic effort for which millions and millions wouldn't be enough, right? And I'm not being pedantic. People who fixate on those narrow, imprecise, inaccurate, realistic things are pedantic, because they presume that that's their thing, right? People like to interiorize the idea that that thing is so realistic. I appreciate only the artistic value in any kind of reenactment. It can be a cinema, a movie, etc. If you actually make me feel like as if I was transported by this atmosphere and I leave an emotion, you've done your job, right? I can look at a brutally ahistorical, fight that is but if there is something about that, if there is an atmosphere, if there is a spirit, there is something, in fact, moral that makes me participate to it, great, right? You know how many kids surely are inspired by, watching reenactment. That is one of the most beautiful things you can do. It's like when people message me and tell me that they begin to study history because they watch my videos. I'm doing nothing really dramatically special. I'm doing my historical stuff in my private, say, professional life, and I try just to stay afloat. What I do here is enough to inspire and enough to improve. But it's not what is needed. Well, it's not enough. You will not find answers that you cannot process by yourself. But this must actually happen through an improvement. It cannot happen through pretending that you stop to a standard that you presume being the satisfactory one. Let's make it simpler. If you stop to any standard, you're not historical. Like, history is based on perpetual research and nothing else, because that's the exclusive way any person can come to improve something. There is not fixed, certified material. You can't say, this is historical, so if I learn it or watch it or whatever, I leave the real experience, or something that comes close to it. It doesn't work like that. It never worked like that. It's not supposed to work like that. History is real as long as it's based on real evidence. That is the one that you get from reality. History doesn't need to be fictionalized. That's another thing that I get. History stories are fiction. History is not fiction. Cannot be fiction, because in the moment in which it starts being, it's a story. It's not a history anymore, right? It can't be inspired. It can be, accurate in the sense that there is a care for the detail, for a certain aspect that you want to, let's say, through which you want to increase the proximity to what history has come to show us that was probably the reality. But if you don't get the inner connections that exist between those details, and because you haven't passed yourself through the historical process, you will be prone normally to believe that that's the case. It's very easy to do. Like, it's like when you're a kid. Kids on average do not have a specific historical competence. Some have legitimately. We all have it in certain degree, but let's say compared to an actual historian adult, let's say, and you can easily remember when you were a kid, you looked at certain movies, you thought it was real. Right, you thought it was historical. You look at costumes and you said, okay, well, I'll take this. But those things inspired, and that is wrong. So you, as an adult, you can say, look, that thing was wrong. So I got tricked like that. But what makes the difference, as in history, as in life, is that you were inspired by that thing. For you, it morally left within you a feeling, a spirit, something that probably will make you become a historian as an adult, because you want to know better what the spirit of that was, right? It's, of course, visual aspects do fascinate, right? But once again, they do fascinate because they have an effect on you. And when you understand that that effect is fundamentally, a kind of fiction, and that you can do better, you will skip that and you will say, you know what, I don't deserve to let myself being tricked by something that the more I discover, that the more I know it's virtually influent, right? And where the world that stood behind these things is much more complex, and it drives away from this modern lunacy of thinking that history is just about costumes or weapons. If you look at the political, social dimension, you lack everything, right? If you lack that, you lack everything, and there is nothing you can. There is no armor you can replicate % that will make you replicate what men that were inside of it at the time were about. And if you don't look for the human factor, right, you don't look at history. You look at something else that is not historically useful. And this is the only truth that we are confronted with, right? The truth of not knowing the truth. And this is probably, we can grasp something, and we can do it just through the real. And the real is the evidence, right? And just for the record, when we talk about specifically military competence or whatever, I will skip any of those other, examples that I found here. People, I don't know, trying to show others how, a medieval unit would change front, like with, two files of guys that basically turn 180 degrees. And everybody goes nuts saying, oh, look at how they use these tactics to change front and battlefield. But we know perfectly well that, there is, from Xenophon even, there is an internal disposition of troops within a formation that you cannot make turn 180 degree and making the formation, the unit being effective, right? This didn't exist historically speaking. So, and obviously the more even with larger formations, and they were segmented inside. The individual capacity of people were trained to follow just that guy in the front. That would be, even in there, also with a different equipment. Yes, that is also a factor, as we were saying before, distributed along the ranks, etc., with a certain orientation, with commanders placed in crucial parts of the formation for which they're specifically trained for. This is completely all skipped, and it is just, look, these guys change front 180 degrees. So out of 10 people, there will be 7 who think, oh, that's how they did, and that you can use it on a field. Yeah, I know, I'm being kind of harsh, because it's obvious that those 7 people out of 10 will have nothing to do with history in the first place, so they're excused for it. But still, wouldn't it have been more historically intelligent and useful for people, and to make actual historical disclosure to explain that 180-degree turn is bullshit from a military point of view? No, because they just want, of course, they want their likes, they want their views, etc. I understand them, because I also here make the same, but at least I try to do it sometimes. And these are episodes, by the way. Other people make astonishing job, and they deserve all what they get in positive terms. We try to go beyond. Like, if you know the thing and you don't say it, that starts becoming also morally problematic. But the problem in today's society is that we kind of, that we kind of know that there are people who know more, but until we don't know what that more is, we want to pretend as if we had the better more, and instead we have nothing, right? And it's a matter of ego and prestige and all this stuff, and it's difficult to cope with these psychological things because it's fundamentally impossible to. So before I was telling you, talk about command and the actual experience that arrived from even a clash or an experience, something like that, even in a reenacted context. The problem is the following. There is no thing like testing what your command capacities are until you don't actually command, and you do it in a real war, right? That is to say, a person who commands even 150 people in a modern war today surely has a better idea what it means to be out there in let's say I don't know, in the Middle Ages, in even if weapons are different, once again, those do not make a difference, because the problem of command is maintaining a mental control in the situation, right? And in a reenacted context where you don't even kill people because it's naturally not your aim, and therefore, what is your aim? If in war that's the only aim from a military point of view, how and you're not actually, and the aim there is not the aim meaning, okay, I switch my brain killing people mode. The aim there means that there is a huge burden from wherever you come from to be on that field on that day, and an enormous push to try to fuck your enemy in a way that he doesn't expect, right? That that derives from such an overwhelming pressure that you cannot replicate in a reconstruction, because you're not trying to do that. You're just simulating something as it comes, right? And therefore, when I meet people say, okay, here there is a deep understanding of combat because they experienced that thing. I met people who even smashed their heads in these combats and said, blood is tough. Surely we're courageous, but had not even the slightest idea of differences, like, still confusing logistics with supplies, because the 16-year-old 1.0 believes that war is all about logistics, man. Tactics is for kids. With logic, you can screw up perfectly with a fully supplied army. And unfortunately, the art of war has nothing to do with logistics properly meant, but actually with the strategical meaning of supply and how you do it. Logistics is just a branch of just saying, what's military engineering to building a trench, right? The way you and how and when and where you build a trench is a completely different thing from military engineering. That is engineering at the end of the day. So there, you have this intellectual because they're deeply connected deficiencies of people that presume that they're schooling others about things that they do not even know the ABC themselves. And these are things that are studied in all military academies. Because guess what? That's where we form people to go out there, literally commanding people, having on the burden of thousands of lives on their back, and trying to make them work in a context where the enemy is not joking, is not playing, is not at a carnival, is not at a festival, is out there to blow your brains out, and you have to do all what is necessary to win, and not in the clanic brotherhood way of primitive peoples that have to cope just with the life of other 20. Here we're talking about the fact that that every decision you take can easily wipe out 5,000 people at a time, and that is on you, and that will happen, and you will regularly do it in a scenario that is so complex where the individual has basically no importance and command, and the collective spirit has everything in that sense. And this is, once again, not to underestimate any single aspect of this, because it's obvious that to the individual person, that thing will make their difference. Those are 5,000 people that will never come back home. That will change everything for their families, for the future of that country, for everything, right? It will have a dramatic impact. But for the sake of war, of the actual military, of waging war proper, that thing is necessary to actually win a war. That is the bigger picture that you're missing if you think that the objective of a war is saving the life of a person. The objective of war is not saving lives, it's winning. It's compelling the enemy to fulfill your will. And it turns out, if you study military history, that is obtained overlappingly just through killing the enemy. War is not a humanitarian business, or better, it is, because if you fight it well, less people will die, right? But in order for that to happen, you have to prepare your mind not to care about those 5,000 that just died because of your orders. And this is why we don't find, Napoleons or Hannibals among 10 people or 100 people, 1,000 people, but much more, because the mental capacities needed to cope with that are not something that you can have just, I don't know, if you are a psychopath that is able to go in the face of combat because it doesn't understand the concept of danger, or because you're an orphan that had to raise his family, therefore feels, when it gets in the army, feels these guys are their brothers and sisters. and therefore does something heroic. That's just for earning a Victoria Cross or a Medal of Honor for bravery. But bravery is, stopped in front of the first machine gun that you find, and that if you don't know how to cope with that in terms of command, you're going to get yourself killed first, and then all the people that are next to you. Because war is not won with good intentions, but how you can try to make work this unpredictable system that is the most unpredictable in any other human activity, given the sheer pressure that exists in war, that doesn't exist concentrated on such a narrow amount of persons in time and space, than any other human activity. It doesn't matter how big the change is, politically or socially. So it's useless to kid ourselves into pretending that reality is easy to understand, that enough to be competent to read 3 or 4 books, that it just takes to know how to use a sword to understand what military art is. This is not real. This is not historical. This is not scientific. There is no scientific or historical evidence that this has anything to do with what is taken to actually do the thing, because it's just a modernistic mental abstraction and speculation. And we know it from, in terms of literally philosophy of science, of actual scientific method. It doesn't work like that. In order to know how to do things, you have to do them. Otherwise, you don't know how to, right? And what we talk about history for, if you wonder, is that we found out that next to command experience, that is actually also reconstructible from a historical point of view by the same commander that was there. Military history is a useful integration to it. There is a positive evidence deriving from the studying of campaigns and battles, not of engineering, steel or ballistics, right? In a technologistic positivistic sense, as if those actually made the decisive difference. That reveals you what the art of war properly was, because either if you were a military commander or a historian, a military historian, and that you are basically the same people if you are the first one, you try to reconstruct what the actual wall of that war was actually about and how it worked, right? For real, because that's not a fantasy story. That's not a fiction. That's not a war game. That's not a reconstruction of something, ex nihilo, let's say itself, from itself. But it's what actually happened in history. And every person who has studied more of these things for years knows that there is a pattern there that won't make you, in that case, I'm a military historian, and I don't think that I don't know, actually, because we cannot know until you're tested, but statistically, I know I'm probably not a good commander. Because mentally I would probably break, as most people, right? But at least I make an effort to understand what the concreteness of the whole thing that has nothing to do with what that single soldier thought or was trained like or whatever, but what the whole of them and how they were commanded actually impacted history. And let's say in that sense this is what von Clausewitz did, write a theory of the art of war, right? I do the easiest thing because I study mostly tactics, right? And I've rarely found peers in this regard. I know people who study tactics, but they studied through a certain, I think only one person I've met that had that specific interest, but also, too few evidence in that specific historical context to actually, because we also have to surrender to the absence of enough evidence, historically speaking, for many contexts, right? But I don't know where he's at that point, because it was just en passant. But because strategy is way more complicated, but also in there it overlaps with other fields, political and social one, they're also more complicated, so it really becomes very, very difficult. But von Clausewitz built his entire theory of war on military history. He says it explicitly when talking about history. There is no way out. There is no other way out for building a theory of the art of war but studying campaigns and battles, because those are the single most important things and make the difference. What a commander-in-chief decides is more important than whatever 10,000 people are. And I'm talking from a human point of view on the field, right? So it's useless to even question if, that musket fired, at 20 or 30 meters of useful range, more or less, to determine what the causes of that, battle outcome actually were. Some people like to think it is. It's, until, this is the point, until you keep it for yourself. I'm not saying it's okay, because still it's difficult to keep it for yourself, but exactly that's the point. But when you start telling to other people and convincing them in your own delusion, in your own ignorance on such matters, because most historians, nor archaeologists, nor reenactors actually know anything about this stuff, you're actually deluding other people. That is to say, those people, who didn't know anything about it before, maybe now they know something, and they are maybe incentivized to take the path. But statistically, even in there, I didn't see that happening. I see just a lot of people were convinced ever and ever more to the easiest, cheapest thing. That is to say, it's what the individual does, or what weapon it uses that actually makes the difference in war. That has nothing to do with real war. We know it. We know it, right? It's real. That is real. That is realistic. That is accurate. The rest is delusion. And naturally I will talk more about this stuff, because it's probably the hardest problem we have with military history at so many levels, because we oversimplify everything at that point, everywhere. International politics, social issues. Look at, literally, think of the average person and what they think about what is happening, between the United States and Russia today, right? And see what their average explanations are, independently from their side, right? And then just reads, like, it can even be an osprey, and check how that even relatively superficial, inquiry, I love ospreys, but, of course, there is way better than them, that is based, in fact, on other literature, is already more in-depth and complex and insightful than what those adult people who actually vote, pay taxes, and educate, raise children and so on, actually think. And then don't wonder where things go wrong, why they do. Because those people, we are as people the problem. Because we always make this mistake. Every time we pretend to talk about things we do not know. So that I'm a historian, I don't know nothing about medicine or about engineering. I can read stuff and I can understand it, but I'm basically trusting somebody else, in a sense. I have some critical capacity. Yes, I hope I can satisfactorily understand certain things, but it's not because I can actually become at that point a doctor or an engineer. Well, with history, that is becoming increasingly more popular, well, there is this tendency, right? Because there is no responsibility, apparently. Instead, there is a huge one, because history is political in every single bit of it, and it has an impact. Through every single bit of it on the world, the way you look at history changes the world, right? It's always been the case. And about something so serious like war, especially, we have, unfortunately, I wouldn't say all literature is good on this, and this is exactly the problem. As a historian, I naturally talk badly about the average historian, as much as I do for the average archaeologist, or the average reenactor, or the average everybody, the average doctor, the average economist, because the average sucks in the world. Let's be honest, even in the best places. It's always like this. We know that for the best standards we can hope for, the average is disgusting. It doesn't matter whether you have a degree, you have a PhD, averagely, that is not enough, right? That's the point. So much, effort, so much disappointment, because at the end of the day, people then get disappointed, because they the more get into the thing with prejudices and preconceptions, and the more eventually they crush with reality. So that is helpful. telling the truth. But this crash can also cause some damage around. So sometimes if you don't have a structured education path through that understanding, don't think that things can be fixed alone. That's where we remain average and we don't actually get where we already know that things are. But the greatest problem is to make the mass lifting up to that point. Because up to that point, in fact, that will be the main problem. And not the fact that we actually already know how things work. That's it. Right, so this is just, this was very polemical today, but I hope this rant can be the, can wake up somebody's conscience, because frankly, it's a serious problem, and we will keep talking about this naturally and get ever more in detail about explaining why you cannot banally even calculate what a battle outcome is on the base of weapons, because at that level, if there is an evidence asymmetry that makes somebody at disadvantage, that somebody may not fight, or may fight in another moment where he has fixed enough to increase that effectiveness. But even again, weapons are not the deal. A duel is not to be solved by an engineer. A duel is to be solved by somebody that wants to kill the person that has in front of them. It doesn't matter what they have in their hands, if we want to be concrete about how historically things happen. Because otherwise you couldn't explain anything that historically went straight from that, which happens on a regular basis, basically in every battle. Because surprise, surprise, warfare is not a deterministic, it's not a determined thing. Like life, the world is not a determined reality. Things can go in different ways, at least in the way we can predict them or intervene in them. So deal with it and stop being obsessed about alleged realism and study history, because that's literally the only thing that can make you closer to what you are actually interested in. Most people won't do it. Also because it's another problem, we're not taught collectively what history even is. We confuse it with stories, and that's why it's so hard to distract people from fiction when they actually have reality next to them and they don't even see it. And this is the problem with our mind, right? We don't use it. We don't know how to use it because that has the answer. Our synthesis capabilities are the answers. Limited knowledge is not the answer. Right? Anyhow, well, for today we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.